Good evening and welcome to The Strand. I'm Christina Foxley, the Director of Events, and I'm so pleased to welcome Phoebe Hoban here tonight to discuss her latest biography, Alice Neel, The Art of Not Sitting Pretty. Hoban is the first to tell the story of artist Alice Neel in full, in this entrancing and commanding biography. In its starred review of the book, Booklist wrote, "Judicious and ardent, Hoban has created a galvanizing portrait of a rebel artist who remained true to her humanist convictions." The book was named one of the 10 best books of 2010 by The Village Voice, and Oprah's O Magazine named it one of the 15 books to watch for in 2011. Phoebe Hoban has written widely about culture and the arts, from investigative features to major profiles, for a variety of publications including the New York Times, New York Magazine, Vogue, Vanity Fair, GQ, Harper's Bazaar, Art News, and the New York Observer. Her biography of Jean-Michel Basquiat, now a Penguin paperback, was a national bestseller and a New York Times notable book of the year. Following her presentation, Phoebe would be happy to take your questions. She'll then stick around and sign books for you, which you can purchase downstairs on your way out of the store. Please join me in welcoming best-selling biographer Phoebe Hoban to the Strand.
Thank you. Yes, I see it. Thank you, Christina. One thing that Christina did not mention in her intro is that I actually am very happy to be back at the Strand because I worked here. I worked in the basement of the Strand. It was my very first job in New York in my 20s, and pretty Dickensian. The basement has vastly improved since then. And I also haunted the Strand during the research for both my Basquiat biography and this biography because the Strand has one of the best art history sections around, especially for the price. I'm not going to so much discuss my book as read a sort of cohesive bit that I've put together that is where I've redacted 3 or 4 chapters that take you up until about Neel's 30s. They're very condensed versions of actual chapters, so I'll read you a few paragraphs about her time in Cuba, and in the book that might be 30 pages. It uses actual language from the book, but this is a very, very condensed version because it was the only way to kind of give a snapshot of the sort of colorfulness and the full arc of Neel's life. So I'm not going to be skipping around from section to section the way most people do. Her paintbrushes and glasses still rest by the easel in the Upper West Side apartment where Alice Neel spent the last 22 years of her life. The living room overlooking Broadway and 107th Street, which also served as her studio, is filled with 1950s furniture. The surfaces are strewn with artifacts. On top of a dresser is a faded snapshot of Jose Santiago Negron, the father of her oldest son Richard, a handsome Puerto Rican musician who later became a priest. There are paintings everywhere, on the walls, stacked in the hall. Everything has been left just as it was when Neel lived and worked here, covering hundreds of canvases with ruthlessly honest portraits of the people who intrigued her, from neighborhood children to Andy Warhol. Like the Pollock-Krasner house in the Springs, where Jackson Pollock's half-filled gallons of paint and cans of brushes remain in suspended animation, Neel's place has been frozen in time since her death in 1984. But unlike Pollock's studio, which has been carefully preserved as a temple to its former resident genius, no effort has been made to sanctify the Neel home. Like the artist who lived there, it remains strikingly uncontrived. All that's missing is the powerful presence of Neel herself. Alice Neel liked to say that she was the century, and in many ways she was. She was born into a proper Victorian family and came of age during suffrage. The quintessential bohemian, she spent more than half a century, from her early days as a WPA artist through her Whitney retrospective in 1974 until her death 10 years later, painting, often in near obscurity, an extraordinarily diverse population, from young black sisters in Harlem to the elderly Jewish twin artists Raphael and Moses Sawyer to Linus Pauling, creating an indelible portrait of 20th century America. Neel's hundreds of portraits portray a universe of powerful personalities and document an age. Neel painted through the Depression, McCarthyism, the Civil Rights Movement, the sexual revolution of the 60s, feminism, and the feverish 80s. Fiercely democratic in her subjects, she portrayed her lovers, her children, her Spanish Harlem neighbors, pregnant nudes, crazy people, and famous art world figures, all in a searing psychological style uniquely her own. From village legend Joe Gould with multiple penises to Frank O'Hara as a young poet, from porn star Annie Sprinkle, gussied up in leather, to her own nude pregnant daughter-in-law, Neel's portraits are as arrestingly executed as they are relentlessly honest. Neel's life and career were as full of Sturm and Drang as the century she powerfully captured in paint. Neel managed to transcend her often tragic circumstances, surviving the death of her infant daughter Santiana, her first child by the renowned Cuban painter Carlos Enriquez, the breakup of her marriage, a nervous breakdown resulting in several suicide attempts for which she was institutionalized, and the terrible separation from her second child, Isabella. Although Neel suffered enormously, she never became a victim. Unlike Frida Kahlo, whose work brilliantly fetishized her personal pain, Neel transformed her deepest wounds into her most humanistic work. And unlike Mary Cassatt, who beautifully chronicled family life in the 19th century, but never married or had children, Neel painted from first-hand experience of the vicissitudes and rewards of marriage and motherhood. In every aspect of her life, Neel dictated her own terms, from defiantly painting figurative pieces at the height of abstract expressionism, convincing her subjects to disrobe, which many of them did, including Andy Warhol, to becoming a single mother to 2 sons. No wonder she became the de facto artist of the feminist movement. Very much in touch with her time, Neel was also always ahead of it. Although she herself would probably have rejected such labels, she was America's first feminist multicultural artist, a populist painter for the ages. I painted the neurotic, the mad, and the miserable. Also, I painted the others, including some squares. Like Chichikov, I'm a collector of souls, she liked to say. Alice Neel was born into a tiny town outside Philadelphia at the turn of the century, during the Victorian age, when women were permitted to do little else but marry and bear children. "I don't know what you expect to do in the world, Alice. You're only a girl," Neel's mother warned her. She might as well have waved a red flag at a bull. Neel later said the comment made her ambitious. Neel was conventionally pretty, but from an early age her quirks were apparent. "I would have a convulsion if a fly lit on me," she said. "The tale of Christ nailed to the cross would send me into violent weeping." But despite her psychological and emotional insecurity, Neel always knew she wanted to be an artist. "I don't know where it came from, but when I was 5 or 6, my most important Christmas present would be the coloring book." Neel found Colwyn to be completely stifling. In the spring it was beautiful, but there was no artist to paint it, and once a man exposed himself in a window, but there was no writer to write it. There was no culture there. I just despised it. Her life and career were a violent rebellion against the values of her drab hometown, with its numbing normalcy and rigid constraints. Although she frequently returned home, seeking comfort from her mother between recurrent crises, she was hell-bent on escaping it. Neel would lead a life that was wild even by bohemian standards and create a deeply original body of work. It would be shaped by 3 potent forces: her relentless and transcendent desire to paint, her ongoing struggle with the hardships of poverty, and her adamant refusal to conform. Neel was uncompromising in her absolute drive. In the end, it is that which enabled her to survive and to leave an enduring mark. Neel went to one of America's first women's art schools, the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, now Moore College. She specifically chose the school over the more famous Pennsylvania Academy of Arts for several reasons. "I was very beautiful then, and all the boys chased me. I chose a woman's school so there wouldn't be anyone to distract me. Even more importantly," she said, "I didn't want to be taught Impressionism. I didn't see life as picnic on the grass. I wasn't happy like Renoir." By the time Neel graduated from the Philadelphia School of Design, she would prove that she had the 2 qualities she deemed were essential for the life of an artist. You know what it takes to be an artist? Hypersensitivity and the will of the devil, to never give up. The summer she turned 24, Neel spent 3 weeks at the Chester Springs Country Art School, located in a picturesque corner of Pennsylvania. Although she completed only half the course, her stay there would radically transform her life and her work. It was at Chester Springs that she met Carlos Enriquez, with whom she fell passionately in love and whom she would marry the following year. There are no records documenting the initial meeting between Alice Neel and Carlos Enriquez de Gomez, who arrived at Chester Springs after attending business school in Philadelphia. Carlos, like Alice, was intent on becoming a serious artist and came across as an exotic bohemian. But in fact, he was from one of the wealthiest families in Havana, where his father, a major sugarcane plantation owner, was later physician to Cuba's president. Even years later, Alice enthusiastically described him as gorgeous, and Carlos was in fact tall, dark, and handsome. In high school, he had been nicknamed the Mosquito, as much for his high-strung energy as his high-pitched voice. He was thin and wiry, with wavy hair and a trim mustache. In old black-and-white photographs, his physical intensity and dashing nonchalance are striking. A picture of him and Alice's sweethearts at Chester Springs, sitting on their favorite bench under a tree, shows him sporting a dapper bow tie. Carlos was an infusion of vivid color into the muted palette of Alice's life. "That was the first time I really fell in love," she said. But if it was nearly instantaneous, the first phase of the romance was also short-lived. Like Alice, Carlos didn't get along well with authority figures. Although Alice said that he was expelled from the school for doing nothing much more than taking walks with her in the evening, he was at loggerheads with the director of the school, and Carlos and Alice had already attracted notice by their brazen behavior. They cut classes, strolled hand in hand through the woods, arranged private evening rendezvous, and, taking advantage of a costume trunk that was also used for sketch classes, even showed up at the school's masquerade party in drag. Neel dressed as a man, and Enriquez as a glamorous flapper. Neel often talked about the awful dichotomy she felt towards motherhood. She stalled for over 6 months after marrying Carlos Enriquez before he finally persuaded her to travel with him to Havana. It's difficult to imagine the intensity of Neel's first impression of Havana. Nothing could have prepared her for the sheer exoticness of the tropical port, from its flora and fauna to the rich resonance of its language. The city had a lush, lyrical quality in keeping with its lilting, omnipresent music, and it was drenched in light and color. Neel must have been equally overwhelmed by the extravagant luxury of the Enriquez household. Having grown up in cramped, dark, low-ceilinged rooms in a working-class town, Neel suddenly found herself not only in a glamorous, cosmopolitan city, but living in a marble-floored mansion with gracious rooms, wide hallways, and huge arched windows. Alice referred to it as a palace. There was even a charming balcony off the bedroom that she shared with Carlos, overlooking a small garden where peacocks strutted. Within walking distance of the house was the magical Malecon, the curving seaside balustrade that was a favorite promenade for upper-class Cubans. At 6 each day, the hour of the promenade, Neel, Carlos, and her in-laws would tool along the Malecon in the Enriquez's chauffeured Rolls-Royce. It would be Neel's first and last encounter with such material wealth. Years later, she still marveled at the Enriquez lifestyle. Carlos's father was the most famous doctor in Havana, Dr. Carlos Enriquez de Gomez. You can't imagine how they lived, Neel recalled. On the grand scale, you know. The family had 7 servants. One was a cook who just cooked all day. His mother as a girl was dressed by slaves. And they lived in this white palace in El Vedado with peacocks walking in the garden. I had a room like Romeo and Juliet's with marble floors and a balcony. My God, it was fantastic. Alice and Carlos lived with his parents for about 8 months. As an American, Alice was certainly not expected to conform to the strict turn-of-the-century etiquette that until recently had been required of Cuban upper-class women, who were not allowed to roam the city freely, but were either driven to the shops and restaurants or confined to their homes or to private clubs. Still, Neel's behavior must have been a constant affront to her affluent, old-fashioned in-laws. Alice consorted with the servants. She would spend time in the kitchen with the cook, practicing her Spanish. "I wasn't made to sit on the patio and do embroidery," she said. In the evening, she would go out to join Carlos and not return until the wee hours. And there was a much more profound tension. In April, just 2 months after her move to Havana, Neel discovered she was pregnant with her first child. "I should have had some birth control thing because I was then simply an ambitious artist. But anyway, when I got pregnant in Cuba, that was it." Of course, Carlos's father was 100% against abortion. But Neel was intent on not letting her pregnancy prevent her from painting. She and Carlos liked nothing better than to take a bus from El Vedado to the poor sections of town, Alice colorfully dressed in the native garb. Equipped with their paint boxes, like, as she put it, Van Gogh, they would stroll the streets and paint the street people. "All we did was paint day and night," she said. The scenes in these outlying neighborhoods were in vivid contrast to the elegant streets of Carlos's home. As Neel described it, there the Afro-Cubans would be dancing. They'd dance like mad and run into the bushes, you know for what. They'd use this strange language, part African and part Spanish. And what dancers, wild, you know. Neel was particularly taken with the bearing of these Cuban women. They have more self than American women. They are highly sophisticated. The American woman was weak